So up until this point, we've really been talking about how do you configure a Dynamics 365 implementation for functionality that's really going to be consumed by people who are inside the application. So when you think about things like business process flows or things when we start talking about knowledge management and some of those types of things, those are typically things that internal Dynamics 365 users are going to be consuming and working with throughout the context of the application. But more and more we start getting into scenarios where you want to work with people who aren't necessarily Dynamics 365 users. Maybe you have a proposal that you're sending out to a customer and you want to be able to go through and work with a specialist from a specific area of your organization who might be able to provide insights on how to work with that. And so from a Dynamics 365 standpoint, there's a lot of integration options, particularly with Office 365. And more we're starting to see that integration line between the two applications is really starting to become kind of blurred. So what we want to talk about in this module is what are some of the options that you have when starting to connect a Dynamics 365 organization to an existing Office 365 subscription, so you can really take advantage of some of the different features out there that will provide some of those collaboration capabilities and also better email tracking capabilities versus just some of the out-of-the-box functionality. So in this module, we want to look at what are some of the different options that you have in regards to connecting to a Office 365 subscription. What are some of the capabilities you have around email? What are some of the capabilities you have around just user collaboration as a whole? So we'll talk a little bit about using tracking folders to be able to track emails and automatically associate emails with Dynamics 365 records. We'll talk a little bit about how you set up and configure Office groups for collaboration. So if you want to create a specific group for an opportunity that allows you to, define who those people are, interact with different people inside your organization who may not be Dynamics 365 users. What are some of the options that you have in regards to that? We'll talk a little bit about how you set up and configure server-side SharePoint integration, because server-side SharePoint integration not only is really going to give you some of your document collaboration capabilities, but it's also going to give you the functionality that you might use for OneDrive integration and OneNote integration if you want to have enhanced note-taking functionality throughout the application. So we really want to go through and just explore what are some of the different ways that you can extend this functionality out a little bit by bridging that gap between Dynamics 365 and Office 365. So why is there a need to integrate with Office 365? Well, you think about, realistically how people work today. Most of us have a tablet device or a phone device that we're using to check our emails. And oftentimes we're not necessarily using, a specific email client, depending upon the type of device, whether it's an iPhone or whether it's an Android type of device. There's usually a specific email client built into that operating system that you're using to track your email. Now, the nice thing is you can connect that subscription or you can connect that device to your Office 365 email account. So you're still going to have like all of the folders and items that you would use for storing information together. So the nice thing about that is I want to be able to go ahead and create Dynamics 365 email activities on the fly, just simply by moving something from one folder now to another folder. Now I want to have an email activity be automatically created. So I don't necessarily have to worry about having a specific client installed on any specific device that I might be working with. So it just provides kind of that level of flexibility. The other reason why you might be looking at connecting with a Office 365 subscription is just from a collaboration standpoint. Realistically, you're not always going to have Dynamics 365 users that you need to work with. Sometimes you might have a specialist in a specific department who understands zoning, and so now you have a document that you want to associate with an opportunity inside Dynamics 365, but you want to be able to get feedback from people who may not have a Dynamics 365 license. By using different situations like OneDrive for Business or even just SharePoint document integration, now I have an area where I can put stuff from inside the user interface of Dynamics 365, but I can now expose that and make that accessible to people outside of my traditional Dynamics 365 subscription. I also would maybe want to be looking at note-taking functionality. Yes, we can do notes and we can add notes to records inside the application, but again, now you're running into a situation where the notes that you're taking are stored inside Dynamics 365. We don't necessarily have all of the necessary capabilities to be able to do checklists or handwrite those notes, or even put in images or items that might support some of the different functionality or use cases that we're working with. So by replacing some of the note functionality with OneNote, now we have that dynamic capabilities that OneNote provides us. Now the additional capabilities around that are the fact that a OneNote workbook can actually be shared out with, again, non-Dynamics 365 users. So it's all about forcing collaboration and allowing collaboration with people that are not going to be consuming the data in your traditional Dynamics 365 way. They're coming in as kind of a support mechanism and allowing you to work through that. And so there's a lot of different scenarios that are conducive to that. And then unfortunately, out of the box, there's a lot of configuration options that you can do from a Dynamics 365 perspective that are going to allow us to set up and configure those individual items. So if you think back all the way to Module 1, one of the things that we talked about was email management. And we walked through the concept of setting up email server profiles so you could take advantage of Dynamics 365 server-side synchronization process. And the advantage to using server-side syncing is when an email is present or when something happens at a server level from an Exchange standpoint, that can automatically translate over into Dynamics 365 and create the relevant activity inside the application. Same thing if you're going the other way. If you're starting from a Dynamics 365 standpoint and you create something that can now come in and send on behalf of somebody else and now appear as a sent item inside their Exchange. What's nice about that is that eliminates the need to always have to have the Outlook client installed for individual users that are working with it. There's still obviously advantages to using the Outlook client, but by using server-side synchronization, now we have the capabilities to really take that to the next level. And so one of the things that actually gets enabled or has the ability to be enabled through that process is a concept called folder tracking. And we talked a little bit about this at the top of the module, but if you think about it from an email perspective, one of the things that comes in is we're going to get an email. And I want that email to be a Dynamics 365 activity. So now I'm going to decide that I want to track that inside the application. There really was no mechanism outside of folder tracking to be able to do that if you weren't using a traditional supported email client. Now with this concept of Exchange folder tracking, I can just simply move that email to a specific folder that I've determined or created inside my profile. And once I do that, the server-side synchronization process is actually going to go through and promote that to an email activity inside Dynamics 365 so I can use that moving forward. Now, that's one of the things that we want to show you is what does that concept look like? So there's a few different tiers that actually have to take place. The first thing is you have to have, as I mentioned, server-side synchronization enabled for your organization. So that's something that has to be done and set up for the individual users who will be working through it. So on their mailbox profile, you want to be using server-side synchronization for kind of incoming emails as they're coming through. The other thing that you have to do is you have to enable folder tracking for your organization. So it's kind of a two-tier process. It's enable server-side synchronization first, then go in and at an organization level, enable folder tracking. And that's actually done through system settings. So if we go into administration and system settings, we will see an option there for using folder level tracking so we can enable that. Now, if we don't have server-side synchronization enabled, it won't let us basically move through the process in regards to what we want to do from there. Now, that's done from an organizational standpoint. From a user perspective, each user is going to be handling kind of these folder mapping or folder tracking rules independently. So the first thing that has to be done then is from a user perspective, anybody who wants to have emails to move into those folders, they have to create those folders just like they normally would inside the application itself. Once they've created those folders, then they can map those folders for tracking. So what they would then do is from a personal perspective, I would go in and I would click on the configure tracking rules, and then it will list to me all of the individual folders that I have available, and I specifically just pick the folder in Exchange and then I map that to a specific record inside CRM. Now what's kind of nice about that is as I'm going through and kind of mapping that individual functionality, it'll go through and create that for me and automatically set that situation up. Now I don't necessarily have to map it to a specific record. I could just go ahead and have it be tracked in the application. The thing to remember, if it's tracked inside the application but not mapped to a folder, it'll create the email activity, but it won't associate it with a specific record. So in essence, the record might be orphaned from that standpoint. So what they kind of recommend from that standpoint is if you're going to do that, go ahead and map it to a non-specific record, but make sure that you come in later and then assign that to another record if you need to. So it does at least give you the tracking functionality, but you would be able to come in and work through it from there. Now, there are a couple of things that you have to remember. When something has subfolders, those subfolders are not specifically mapped. Each folder is considered an independent option. So when you're setting up and tracking this functionality, for each folder that you want to map to a specific Dynamics 365 record, you do have to specify what that record is that you want to work with. The other thing is there is a limitation in regards to the number of tracking rules that can be active for a specific user. So each user can have up to 25 tracking rules that they can set up and enable. So during the course of the next scenario, what I want to do is show you what that looks like as we're moving forward. So let's take a look at what this looks like inside the application itself. So as I mentioned, this is a server-side synchronization scenario. So you do have to have server-side syncing enabled. So you would have to go into email configurations and make sure that you do have a server profile created for the environment that you want to work with. The next step to that is then you're going to go ahead and go into settings and administration. And if you remember, under administration, there's a system settings option. And so when we go into system settings, this is going to give us the capabilities to turn on some of these different functionalities. And one of the options that we'll see here underneath email is the ability to configure whether or not I want to use server-side synchronization for the organization. So that has to be set up and enabled and controlled here. But then if I scroll down, there's an option here that says use folder level tracking for Exchange folders. So this is where I would enable this functionality at an organization level. Then I can go ahead and click on OK. Now, that's kind of the end of it from an administrative perspective. The remainder part of this really does take place inside the individual application profile for each user, because each user is going to have separate folders that they would set up inside their Exchange. Now, typically you could do that just through Outlook. You could go into Outlook just like you normally would, right-click, create your folders underneath your inbox to define what specific folders you want to be able to track. So that's just, standard Outlook functionality. Now, if I'm inside Dynamics 365, if I come up here into my administrative settings and I click on settings, one of the options I'll see here is just options. And when I click on options, this is now opening up my personal options. So this is my individualized profile that I'm working with for me as a specific user. One of the options that I have in here is email. And so when I come in here to email, there'll be an option here underneath select the email message to track in Dynamics 365. There's a configure folder tracking rules. And so if I click on configure folder tracking rules, this is where I can set up and define my individualized mappings that I want to work with. So for example, I will go ahead and click on new folder mapping. And then this will list all of the Exchange folders that I have. So these are all the items that are kind of set up underneath my box that I'm working with. So I have a folder here for ADVWorks or for AdventureWorks. And ultimately what would make sense in this standpoint is I would want to, any email that I move into this folder, probably want to have associated with the AdventureWorks account inside Dynamics 365. So if I come over into my lookup icon, now I can select multiple records. And you'll notice in this case it defaults to accounts, but if I go in to look up more records, I could really associate this with any entity type inside the application. So I've got my contacts, I've got leads, opportunities, cases, any of the standardized options that you might be working with. In this case, I want to work with AdventureWorks. So I would go ahead and click on Add. And now this map folder is mapped from an AdventureWorks perspective. Then I could just continue this process through. So I create another new mapping. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and say Jane. I'm going to map Jane to a specific contact, so I'll go to look up more records, switch this to contacts. In here, find the specific person I want to work with. I don't have a Jane, but in this case, we'll just go ahead and map it to Maria, and then I'll go ahead and hit add. Now, the big thing that you have to remember here is once you're done with this, or once you kind of had this information set up, then you're going to go ahead and hit save. And this will then map those options automatically for you. If you forget to do the save, it's not necessarily going to save the information and you won't see the added functionality inside the application. Now this is just a synchronization scenario. So Exchange and Dynamics 365 just go through a situation where periodically they synchronize. So it's not necessarily something that is going to be real time from creating the activity scenario. You can see here that the last one took place about 4 or 5 minutes ago, but it does happen with relative frequency. So you will see this on a fairly regular basis. So they will appear fairly instantaneous, even though they're not necessarily going to be, real-time situations when you're working through it. Another thing that oftentimes happens is this need for collaboration. And then there's a variety of different mechanisms that you can use inside a Dynamics 365 implementation to be able to connect and work with items. One of the options that you would see would be what are called office groups. And so think of office groups as kind of a repository or almost like a document workspace where you're going to assign specific people that you want to collaborate with on a specific mechanism. Now there's a couple of different ways you can do this. There's the Office 365 groups from a Dynamics 365 perspective, and then there's the Office 365 groups connectors. We're going to really focus more on the group solution itself. And so what this is this allows you to actually surface group information from Office 365 inside Dynamics 365 in the context of that record that you're currently working with. Now this is a separate add-on solution that you have to add to your organization. So basically what happens is you go out and you install the solution into your organization, and once that solution is installed, then it basically allows you to configure that functionality inside the application for collaboration perspective. Now the nice thing about that is the groups can be auto-created once you're working with it in the context of the record that you're working through. So the process to actually go through that is you have to go into your Dynamics 365 online administration area instances and surface the solution. So you'll find an Office 365 group solution. You'll go ahead and click on install, and that'll install the solution into your environment. Now that'll take anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes depending upon the situation, but once it's installed, then you have the capabilities to go out and actually configure that functionality for your organization. So you'll have now inside your navigation area, you'll have an Office 365 groups that you can go in and administrate. Now the big thing here, and we'll show you this inside the demonstration as well, is you have to define what the entity is that you want to work with, and then you have to specify whether or not you want these groups to be auto-created for you, which it will do inside the Office 365 subscription. The thing to remember is this is really kind of a customization that you would be making inside the application because you're enabling kind of related items from an application standpoint. So you also need to make sure that you're publishing these customizations when you're done. So you'll see an option here to publish all. If you forget to do the publish all, then that functionality will not technically be enabled for that entity. And that's one of the biggest areas that I see people sometimes forget, is to do that publish all scenario. Once it's published and you've configured it, now when you go into a specific group, the first time that you access the office group situation, it's going to ask you if you want to create the group. It'll create the office group, and then you can provide that collaboration. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that process works inside the application. So I'm back in my Office 365 Admin Center, and I've basically navigated to my Dynamics 365 instances through the admin perspective. And so this is my instance that I want to work with. So when I select the instance, I can see that there's no solutions currently installed into this instance. When I click on solutions, one of the options that I'll see from a solution standpoint is the Office 365 group solution. So what I would do at this point is now select that solution to install it into my organization. So we'll give this just a second to kind of catch up. And then once I pick the group solution that I want to work with, this process, like I said, can take a few minutes to install, so you may need to refresh periodically, but I'll accept the terms of the license agreement and I'll let it run through the install. And again, we'll give this a few minutes to kind of process through and complete the install procedure. So the solution's now successfully installed. So now I can navigate back into my Dynamics 365 instance. So if I come back into my Dynamics 365 instance, one of the areas that I'll see in the navigation now is my Office 365 groups. So if I look underneath System, underneath kind of my activity feeds rules, I'll see an Office 365 groups. I go ahead and I click on that, and this is where I'll basically enable the functionality. So right now I can see that I don't necessarily have any options associated with this. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is this does tell us that we do need to have SharePoint configured and SharePoint integration to be able to facilitate that. And that's actually the next option that we'll show you, is how SharePoint integration works. So first and foremost, we'll just kind of take you in here and we'll let you see, what this process looks like from a configuration standpoint. But normally we would have gone through and done some of the SharePoint integration setup first, but we'll at least set this option up. So I'm going to go ahead and add my entity, specify what entity I want to work with. So I'll see my different entities kind of listed within the application itself. I'll go ahead and pick my specific entity I want to work with, and then I will choose to auto create. And what that'll do is whenever I create that option from that standpoint, it'll then go ahead and auto create the records for me. Now we'll go ahead and add just a couple of these. We'll do for account, we'll do for opportunity, and then we'll also add one for contact. Then I can publish all, and then once I've published all, now I could go ahead and I could consume this feature inside the application. SharePoint integration is a huge aspect of what you're going to be doing from a collaboration standpoint in respect to Dynamics 365. Now, obviously, Dynamics 365 has the capabilities to attach documents to records using some of the note functionality. Historically, the issue that you run into with that is they're almost like an email attachment. When you attach a record to a document to a Dynamics 365 record, you're really getting more of a static copy of that record. So if that document were to ever change in kind of its source area, it would have to be re-added into the Dynamics 365 application in order to facilitate that update. If we go in and we enable things like SharePoint integration, now we have this entire concept of collaborative capabilities, where I have the ability to take a document, and as that document is being changed and as that document matures, now I can see those changes reflected inside the application. The other nice thing about this is where now I have the ability to really collaborate with non-Dynamics 365 users on these documents, because realistically I wouldn't necessarily have to have a Dynamics 365 license to be able to open that record up through the context of SharePoint. As long as I have access to SharePoint through my user account, I can collaborate and work with that document together. The other thing that's nice is now by using some of this functionality, I can take advantage of the versioning capabilities of SharePoint. I can use some of the check-in, check-out functionality, and this is also really the baseline infrastructure to support many of the other features that we would see from a Dynamics 365 standpoint. Office groups is one of them. In order to be able to use kind of document repositories for office group collaboration, you have to have SharePoint integrations enabled. In order to use OneNote integration, you have to have SharePoint integration enabled. And in order to use things like OneDrive for Business, that's all baseline structure built off of this functionality. So this is kind of a critical element moving forward if you want to enable any of the other collaboration capabilities that Office 365 provides you. Now, when we start talking about, what are some of the baseline functionalities that we want to work with, you have to enable either server-side integration or client-side integration. So there's really two options available. We're going to focus from a today perspective on server-side integration. And the reason why we want to focus on server-side integration is because that's what's going to give you the most flexibility from a deployment perspective, because you're going server to server. It does support hybrid scenarios, whether you're working with Dynamics 365 online and a SharePoint on-prem, or any other combination really of the two. The client-side integration, which is typically provided through the list component, does give you SharePoint capabilities, but it really just kind of surfaces that information through an iframe that's formatted in the context of CRM. So it's not a true server-to-server backend, which doesn't always give you the same OneNote functionality and some of the other items that you would be looking at. So typically speaking, you're going to enable server-side integration. And it's really kind of a one-time setup situation. You first will go in, define what it is that you want to work with. You'll define the type of deployment. So again, it does support different hybrid scenarios if you're using SharePoint Online or SharePoint On-premise. Once you enable it though, and once you've configured server-side integration, there isn't a mechanism to switch to client-side integration, which is fine because moving forward, some of the client-side integration stuff is kind of on the roadmap to be deprecated moving forward, and server-side synchronization is really the option that they are encouraging people to be using more often than not. So this is kind of what you would see from a structural standpoint inside the document storage standpoint. You have your Dynamics 365 capabilities, and then you have your SharePoint situation. So within the SharePoint site or within the collection, you will see records that will be associated with different document libraries inside SharePoint. Now those document libraries might have subfolders that are associated with them for better storage, but realistically inside the Dynamics 365 interface, what you're going to see is kind of a hybrid model of all the documents that are associated with that. Now you can have, a singular Dynamics 365 record that is linked to just one specific document location inside SharePoint, or you could have a record that might have multiple document locations. The nice thing about the integration scenario is that's configurable. You can set that up and decide how you want that process to look like in regards to, do you want the folders to be created automatically? And even if they're created automatically, you still have the ability to manually map to a different document location if need be, based upon the needs of the record. So let's go ahead and see what this process looks like inside SharePoint or inside Dynamics 365 to set up and enable that integration. So inside Dynamics 365, I'm going to go into Document Management. And so I'll see that because I haven't configured all of this functionality yet, I still have two options available. I can install the list component, or I can enable server-based SharePoint integration. And again, more often than not, based upon what you're going to be working with, server-side integration is really what is recommended from an application standpoint. And at some point in time, it's not necessarily going to be supported from a list component standpoint. There are plans to deprecate the list component functionality. There's just more, there's just more administration around that and kind of less flexibility moving forward with some of the enable functionality features. So in this case, I'm going to just go ahead and enable server-based SharePoint integration. Tell me kind of what I can do within the context of this situation. So I'll go ahead and hit next. Then it's going to ask me what type of deployment do I want to connect to. Do I want to connect to an online instance, or do I want to connect to an on-prem instance? In this case, I'll just go ahead and connect to an online instance. I'll specify the URL for the SharePoint integration site that I want to work with. I'll go ahead and hit next. It'll then handle the authentication, and obviously because we're working with Dynamics 365 and we're working with Office 365, it'll prompt me if need be to log in, but we're using the same login, so we do have single sign-in capabilities. It's gone out, it's tested the URL to make sure that everything looks okay. It's a valid URL, so now I can go ahead and I can enable this functionality when I'm going through. So it's now basically telling me at this point that once I enable this functionality, I do not have the capabilities to use client-side integration anymore, and that's fine. We'll go ahead and enable it. Tells me that everything is basically ready to go. So now the next step to this is I would have to go in and set up the actual document management capabilities inside the application. And you'll see in here that there's an option to go ahead and facilitate that. So I'll go ahead and open my document management capabilities, and I'll hit finish. So in here I can see what specific items I want to work with. So I've got the capabilities to see that I want to work with the account entity, the articles, categories, opportunities. I can specify which ones I want to work with. These are the ones that typically kind of get enabled from a document management perspective, kind of out of the box. So we'll just go ahead and leave the ones that we have. I'll specify my SharePoint URL and I'll hit next. Then it's going to go through and ask me how I want to work through this. So it's going to tell me that the SharePoint item itself is a valid structure. What particular folder structure do I want to use? So I can base this off of an entity if I want. So if I typically would want to organize documents based upon the account or the contact, I could either have it just kind of create these individual document libraries independent, or I could actually go in and base it off of a specific entity, which in this case makes a lot of sense to do it off the account entity, because a lot of the opportunities and the contacts and the supporting documents that would be attached to that would generally be based off of that functionality. So in this case, we'll just go ahead and hit next. It tells me that they're being created at this particular path and that it might take a few minutes to go ahead and do that, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and click on OK. It'll run through kind of a status validation. So it'll go through and it'll tell me whether or not those items are there. In this case, we've already kind of had this set up in the past with other integrations to other sites, so it tells us that it already exists, which is totally fine. We can go ahead and hit finish. And now that functionality has been enabled for our organization. So now I can see that I have, different options here. I can see that I have OneNote integration, I have Manage Office Graph integration, which is basically my Delve integration, and then I also have the capabilities to enable my OneDrive for Business functionality if need be inside the application. So now I will have for each individual entity the ability to go in and start working with document management library capabilities. Now there's a couple of other just little things I want to mention while we're in here. I'm going to actually go up into settings, and I'm just going to go into customizations real quick. And I'm just going to customize the system. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of different things on the entities themselves. So I'm just going to expand this out and click on the account entity. One of the options that you'll see in here is the ability to handle some of the different collaboration options. So you'll see in here that there's a document management and a OneNote integration capabilities. If you have an entity, whether it's a custom entity or even an out-of-the-box entity that hasn't been enabled for functionality, if you want to be able to facilitate and use that for any functionality, you would have to enable it. So you would have to come into document management, check document management. Same thing with OneNote integration. Check OneNote integration if you want to be able to facilitate that. Once you've turn that functionality on, save and published, then you will be able to take advantage of some of the other use case functionalities like Office Group integration if you wanted to utilize that, or OneNote integration or some of the other capabilities. But it does have to be enabled on an entity by entity basis. The nice thing is you do have some of those options when you initially configure it, but moving forward there may be some options that you have to look at to enable. What's important to remember is that when you're working with SharePoint integration in the context of being displayed inside a Dynamics 365 implementation, you are still working with SharePoint. So what you're seeing inside the application is a link to the SharePoint document library. So if you have a document that you place in there through Dynamics 365 or through SharePoint, it still exists in SharePoint. So if I delete that document from inside the Dynamics 365 interface, it does delete that document inside SharePoint because that's where it's residing. However, if I delete a Dynamics 365 record, I'm not removing those SharePoint documents. All I'm doing is basically removing the link between that Dynamics 365 record and the SharePoint document library. So it's important to note that they still are individual management capabilities, and security is even maintained a little bit individually between the two. So the thing to remember is when you start working through these, they aren't a real-time synchronization scenario. You might have a situation where if you're working through it and you delete a record inside the application, it's still available in SharePoint and you may have to do some administration. Same thing with kind of merging. If you merge records together or Dynamics records together, that merged record will actually have both document locations associated with it because it would have multiple options. So when you start talking about how this process looks from a security perspective, if you want to configure any of the SharePoint integration, you do have to have a system admin role or something equivalent to that situation as you're moving forward. A lot of the options as far as document libraries and permissions, you would have to have access to them in regards to be able to facilitate that. So for document locations, you have to have the appropriate permissions to be able to enable and work with the document location inside the application. However, once you're in that document library, the permissions are independent and they're actually maintained through SharePoint. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing to remember is, the Dynamics 365 security model is very different than the SharePoint security model. So you have to make sure that the integration between the two, that it assumes that both users have permissions on both sides. So not only do you have the ability to access that document location inside Dynamics 365, but I do have the appropriate permissions inside SharePoint to be able to work with things from that standpoint. So they are independent interfaces. So I couldn't use like an access team in Dynamics 365 to grant or restrict access to SharePoint. I can only do that to the context of the record that I'm trying to work with in the application. Another element to consider when you start talking about integration capabilities is, do you want to use the standard Dynamics 365 Note functionality, or would you like to replace that functionality with like OneNote integration? And because you've enabled SharePoint, you now have the capabilities to be able to do that within the context of the application using shared OneNote files. And so the nice thing about OneNote integration is also the standpoint of the fact that I now have the capabilities when I'm working through this to access this OneNote information on any device where I might have access to OneNote. And so there's a OneNote app for mobile, there's a OneNote app for tablets. All of those items now allow me to collaborate and work with these notes inside different versions of the application, even though they may have initially been created inside Dynamics 365. Now, as I mentioned, it's based off of SharePoint integration. So what you'll actually see is when you enable linking to OneNote files, you will actually have each section of a OneNote workbook that'll be displayed as a section option inside the Dynamics 365 application. So you will see individual sections in the notebook that'll link back to items that are displayed inside the application. Those will constitute the individual sections, but once you're in those sections, you have all the same flexibility and options that you would normally have if you were working with kind of standard OneNote files inside the option. So what you have to basically do in there is you have to go in and configure the OneNote functionality. And we talked a little bit about this with the SharePoint functionality, but first you have to enable SharePoint integration. You then have to go in and modify kind of the entity settings to allow it to use OneNote integration. And then you have to modify the OneNote integration settings to basically turn on what functionality you want to use inside the app. So it's kind of a two-tier process. But let's look at what that looks like inside the app. So let's go ahead and hop in and do that. So as you can see, we're on the account entity, and the account entity does have OneNote integration enabled, so we're good to go there. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of the customization or entity definition window, and I'm going to go back into settings and document management. And now within this document management, I'm going to click on OneNote integration. And this is going to open up my OneNote integration, and it's going to look at all the entities that have been enabled for OneNote integration inside the application, and it's going to tell me here's the options that have been enabled. If this was a new one that I wanted, I could just check the box for the option that I wanted to work with. But now I can go ahead and hit finish, and I'll see that the OneNote integration is set up and configured. So let's kind of go back now that we've got all of this individual stuff set up, and let's look at this within the context of the app itself. So I'm going to go back into Sales and Accounts, and I'm going to open up an account. And so now I'll see inside the account, here is my OneNote integration. So when I click on this OneNote, this will load up a OneNote notebook that I can use, that I basically can now access, shared, and edit information directly from within this application. So I can click on this untitled option, I can come into here, and I can start making changes and working directly with this OneNote file from within the context of the application. So this now gives me access to that shared OneNote file that's been created. Now I'm not necessarily going to spend a ton of time in here, but you can see that I have all of the baseline capabilities that I would want to work with, including sharing this notebook with non-Dynamics 365 users. Now let's also look at some of the other items that had come into this as well. So now if I go into my ADatum Corporation, I can look at some of the other options as far as the ADatum Corporation. Here's that Office 365 groups. So remember, we configured that a little bit earlier. Now when I come into my Office 365 groups, this is what will allow me to authenticate to a Office 365 subscription and now load in that collaboration functionality. So this is where I can see that I want to create this information. I'm going to create the new group inside the app. Once the group has been created and we're working with it, now it'll replace this once it takes a couple of seconds to replace this, and now I will actually see the Office 365 integration piece inside here that I can work with. So this gives me the capabilities to, now that I have the group created, to actually provide that collaboration. Now from a document perspective, once we enable SharePoint document integration, now when I click on documents, here's those individual documents that I can see. And I can already see that the SharePoint functionality or the OneNote functionality has already been brought into here, because this is that one file or that item that I had created earlier. So this is how now we have those individual collaborative efforts that have all kind of combined together to be able to work through this. So this is just a great way overall that you can provide collaboration options for everybody using the application. So, collaboration is just a huge aspect on what you would want to do. And it really now starts to allow you to use Dynamics 365 in more innovative ways to allow collaboration amongst different users within your organization. So I highly encourage looking at some of the out-of-the-box capabilities that are there to set up and define that. Whether it's looking at using folder synchronization, whether it's looking at using Office 365 Group, SharePoint, OneNote, OneDrive, whatever the options are, it's all going to provide you with a very unique collaborative experience that you can use when working forward. The nice thing to remember, or as you're configuring some of this information, just remember if you're going to use features like folder syncing is kind of a two-tier process. It has to be enabled first at the organization level through your email settings, and then once it's enabled at an organization level, then you can go in and you can configure it on a user-by-user basis within the context of the application. The other options that you have are like SharePoint integration. Now remember, there's two types of SharePoint integration, but realistically the server-based SharePoint integration is really the one that you're going to want to use most often, because that's the one that not only provides kind of that real-time single sign-on capabilities, but it's also going to give you the options to enable much of the other dependent functionality. So things like Office Groups, OneNote, OneDrive, Delve, a lot of that information is based off of having SharePoint server-based integration set up. Once it's enabled, now you have the ability to allow that collaboration with both Dynamics 365 and non-Dynamics 365 users within the context of the application. Just remember that the permissions are independent, so if you want to restrict what people can do inside the document library, you would have to go into the SharePoint side of things and administrate that. But now you have the ability to do things like OneNote and Office Groups. Remember that with Office Group integration, however, Office Group integration does rely on SharePoint. So you have to have the SharePoint integration set up first, then you can install your Office Group solution into your environment, and then you can go ahead, configure it, and set it up for the individual records that you want to provide the collaboration on. And if you're looking for additional options to really replace some of the note-taking functionality that's inside Dynamics 365, OneNote integration is a great way to facilitate that, because now you have all the checks and balance options that you would normally see inside a shared OneNote file that's now being surfaced inside a Dynamics 365. So as you can see, there's a lot of options when it comes to configuring a Dynamics 365 implementation. Now, before we go through and kind of talk about everything that we've gone through, the big thing to remember is the configuration piece is really going to work hand in hand with the customization piece. And so remember, there is another course specifically devoted to customizing Dynamics CRM, where we talk about creating entities and relationships and working with form customizations, because a lot of the things that we've talked about throughout the course of this content is actually corresponds directly with some of that information. But when you think about configuring and working through those elements, this is where you can really start to enhance that functionality. And so over the last several hours, we've talked about a lot of different things, including just what are the baselines around how do you configure a Dynamics 365 implementation? How do administrative settings fit into play? What do you use and how do you configure auditing? Where would you go in from a duplicate detection standpoint to be able to configure how the application is searching and looking for duplicate records inside the application? We talked a lot about how security structure is based and set up within Dynamics 365. So we looked at things like business units and using business units as kind of a foundation for the boundaries for how you're going to facilitate what records and what functionality inside the application users actually have access to based upon what it is that they're doing. We looked at concepts like security roles and how you can assign one or multiple security roles to an individual user, and then based upon the privileges and the access levels that are associated with that security role for specific entities, how it controls what specific items they have access to within the context of the application. And we looked at how you can use concepts like teams to be able to extend some of that functionality out and now be able to assign records or work with permissions for specific items in the application within the context of that user being a member of a specific team. We explored areas in regards to hierarchical security and how you can use hierarchical security to really enhance the baseline security functionality of the organization organization. And instead of just relying solely on who that user is and what security role they have, we looked at how you can use the concept of who their supervisor is or what their position is within the organization to provide greater visibility into people who either report directly to them or indirectly report to somebody that falls underneath you as an individual. We talked about knowledge management. We talked about how you can surface and do knowledge management functionality searching inside the application. And we looked at how to enable that for specific entities and some of the baseline configuration options that you have to do in order to expose some of that knowledge management functionality and make it available for use on like portals and transferring some of that information over into other areas of the application. We talked about processes and we looked at how do you use workflows and dialogues and custom actions to be able to really enhance what some of the automation processes look like inside the application. Being able to automatically create other records when new items are created just by using a workflow to be able to facilitate that, or maybe use a dialogue to be able to capture information that was missing through other aspects of the application. We introduced or talked a little bit about business process flows and looked at how you can use business process flows to really guide your users through a specific process that you have inside a Dynamics 365 implementation. Maybe taking somebody from a lead qualification process and moving it all the way through until the end and working it through to actually closing that opportunity, creating the order and generating the invoice. And we were able to introduce you to the new business process flow designer that was introduced as part of Dynamics 365 to make it much easier to design those individual business process flows and add additional functionality like workflows and items from that standpoint. And then we also talked a little bit about how do you integrate a Dynamics 365 implementation with Office 365. Where does folder synchronization fit into the mix, and how can you create those folder maps so you can drag an item to a specific folder and have it surface that activity inside the application. We talked about things like Office group integration, so you can collaborate with non-Dynamics 365 users across the context of the application. We looked at replacing note functionality using OneNote and using SharePoint to be able to facilitate document management. So there's a lot of different options that from a configuration perspective that you can do when you're looking at through these different elements. Now, before we close, I guess a couple of just final things that I would like to recommend or just kind of talk a little bit about. We have hands-on lab files that are a part of this course that I would highly recommend downloading from the application drive. This just has a lot of exercises on all the different concepts that we talked about, whether it's creating security structure, whether it's facilitating integration, or even more importantly, if you want to get kind of a true hands-on with the new business process flow designer, using that process as well. So if you haven't already, I would highly recommend downloading that information from there. Well, that's going to do it for this session. I want to thank you very much for watching, and we appreciate your time. And again, my name has been Derek Borman. Take care, everybody, and have a good one.